Oh, I didn't have any. What is this here? All right. Well, we're studying the human life cycle of rebirth. And what we're trying to do is we're trying to understand how it works and what we're doing when we're doing it. In that way, we can work in harmony with it and we can be more efficient. And in studying the life cycle, we are at the point when the spirit is preparing to come back to rebirth. And at this time, it is creating the archetype. And the archetype is a complex thought form that is behind our life and our body, and we're going to find out quite a few other things. It's a thought form that is not a simple thought form. Now, to most people, this sounds strange, because most people make their way through life and they do the kind of thinking that relates to this world. They don't do creative thinking, which is what producing a thought form is like, an archetypal thought form. Now, most of the time, most of us are reacting to circumstances, and we're focusing on matter. Even in social issues, we're focused more on matter and we're reacting to conditions than we are doing creative thinking. And if there is planning, we plan according to material objectives, and we don't plan according to spiritual purpose. Now, there are a few people who get a sense that there is a plan and a purpose behind their lives. You talk to people, and people will mention that. Even fewer understand that they are the creators of the plan of life, and that life doesn't just happen to them, but that they created it long before they ever were born here in this world. But even fewer yet understand how this is done. So what we're trying to do is correct this, remedy this, and it's problematic because I'm not completely awake in this process. But if we don't try to wake up and if we don't try to understand what we're doing, we're not going to understand. Now, the irony of what we're doing is that in this part of the life cycle, it often takes the longest amount of time. This is because people are not skilled creative thinkers. There are other reasons for the slowness, but they'll come up probably next time we meet. Recently in these talks, ironically, we have been stalled because I have been struggling. I've been struggling with trying to understand these things, even though I've pondered them for a long, long, long time. Now, I'm not the only one that struggles. There are greater thinkers than myself who struggle. Einstein said, for example, I think about some things 99 times and I'm wrong. But on the 100th time, I get it. And sometimes even going back to something 100 times is not enough. But you don't want to panic because they're not going to take 100 talks to get through this part of the cycle. We're talking about creative thinking. And creative thought is holistic thought. It's not linear. It's more like an explosion in space that goes every direction. We're accustomed in this world to linear time. One thing happens after another, and that's because of the limitations that we have in this kind of consciousness, in this kind of world. Now, the holes of creative thinking are holes because they come from abstract universals. And being universal, they're total in every dimension. But the problem is we're very deep in this world of limitation and linearity. And we can't do those things here. So, what we're trying to do, instead of trying to produce a whole, I'm going to present a bunch of images and abstract ideas, and hopefully if you put them all together and hold them in your consciousness, you'll get some idea of what creative thinking is like, or you can watch and see if it happens in yourself when you do creative thinking. There is an old Dutch saying that seems to have universal consent, especially with people as they get older and experience more of life. Everybody seems to agree with it. And I'm sure all of you have heard of it. The saying goes, so soon old and so late smart. So soon old and so late smart. Now apparently this applies to mythical figures as much as it does to mundane people like ourselves. King Midas was so late smart after he made the mistake of having his wish granted of changing everything he touched into gold, and his food and even his daughter were turned into gold. And they had to do a lot of reversals there. He still was not smart. And he continued on in his stupidity, as some of us tend to do. And what happened was that Pan, the god of nature and the god of panic, was having a dispute with Apollo, the sun god. And they had a dispute about who made the most beautiful music, Pan or Apollo. Apollo played the lyre, which was something like it's a harp-like instrument. It's a stringed instrument. The first ones were made out of turtle shells with gut placed over them, and they would vibrate. And the string is positive. When it vibrates, it sends off things positively. Pan played what are now called Pan's pipes. And Pan's pipes are tubes where one end is sealed and the other end is open. And when you blow across them, they produce a sound. And the pitch depends on the bore and the length of the tube. And it's vaguely like an echo effect set up inside the tube, and it produces what physicists call a standing wave. You can see that this is more reactive. It's not positive in the same way that the lyre is. So they agree to this contest, but they need a judge. And who is stupid enough to judge a music contest between gods? Of course, it's Midas. And so Pan and Apollo both give their performances, and they asked Midas, who has the most beautiful music? And Midas said, the music of Pan is more beautiful. Apollo is outraged and zaps him and gives him ass's ears. And forever after, he wears a turban to hide his ass's ears. And only his barber knows, but his barber blabbed. But the story goes on from there, but that's enough for what we're doing. And we've been saying what the findings of mystics are regarding concrete thought. Mystics claim that concrete thought is tonal. Thoughts have pitches, they have tones. And that, of course, includes the human archetype. The human archetype lasts for millions of years, even after a person is dead. When the life is over and you're building the new one for the next life, the old one is still there yet. And mystics claim that thought forms are vacuums, that they're at least vacuous. They're like the hollow pipes of Pan. The hollows, or the hollowing of a thought form, is done by questioning. And it's sort of like you produce a thought form by asking a question, and you sort of suck the truth into it. And your questions are answered. But the answer is like the shape of the thought form, and because the truth is universal. Now, Apollo is the sun god, and he represents the transcendental part of the creative cosmos. Concrete thought is in the realm of concretion. It's not universal, but abstract thought, and even more so life spirit, which is pure life in light, pure truth is universal. And so it's positive. And it's sort of like the truth is from the fullness of the spirit that's radiated out like the radiation out of the strings of the lyre. So Pan represents nature. He is the universal nature god. And it bears the impress of spiritual expression. Now, this allegory can be carried even further without stretching it out of representation. The life spirit, that state of being that is pure truth, is in its life, by many schools of mystics and ancient philosophers, was referred to as the breath. In the Greek mysteries, it was called nous. And nous was another name for intellect. And that intellect was pure and divine. It was truthing without even thinking. It was a different kind of consciousness. So, nous was intuitive knowing. And it was a constant flow of truth, so to speak. We're not just talking about the life spirit, but the life in the life spirit that is constantly moving. Now, this image can be carried still further without being absurd. And if you think of life spirit, the breath of life spirit passing across the vacuous thought form, you can see that that is the source of the tone in a panpipe. Now, since this image is of the material world, it can only be distantly representative of what the truth is. It's only an image. And it's your intuition and your imagination that's going to have to bring it in touch with the reality. Now in this there are problems, as there always must be problems. And one apparent problem is, where does the vibration come from in this image? It can't come from life spirit, because life spirit is constant. It is truthing all of the time. It is not oscillatory. Thought stuff is not constant. Now to us, thought stuff is exceedingly subtle and exceedingly elusive to us. It's almost beyond belief. To try to get a hold of a thought and to hold it in your consciousness, even more so to create one, sometimes seems almost impossible. It slips away. Nonetheless, even though it is subtle beyond anything here, much more subtle than beyond anything here in this world, it is still concrete. It has a concrete character to it. And as such, it must be resistant to pure spirit. And so another image will help you to see this, for example. Maybe it will. Suppose you have a constant wind blowing across the smooth surface, like Monona over here. That wind, even though it's steady and constant, will produce ripples in the water, because there is resistance, and the wind blows on it, and it builds up, but it only so far, and there's a limit, and then another ripple forms. And so you can see that there is something oscillatory. Now you're going to get this reminder again and again. These are only images. And they are material images here in a very, very concrete world. The realities are much more subtle. Now the idea might carry through, and it might be analogous on a higher level, but it's not exactly the same thing. Now it's correction time and humiliation time. I'm not going to stand here and try to tell you that you should consider this to be full reality. This is only a simple principle. Greater reality may be based on this and on other simple principles, but it's much, much more than this. If you think of the formation of a civilization, or if you think of all of the information and material and art that is in Wagner's Ring Cycle, or if you think of all of the fantastic detail that's in a Persian rug, there's a lot of complexity. There may be simple principles, but to create the thought that becomes a life, it's not just like blowing across the panpipe. I used to have a set of panpipes. When I went to South America, I picked one up, but I wasn't using them, and somebody liked them, and I gave them away. But they're really nice. All right. Now, we have to try to come to a little bit better or a little less bad understanding of another aspect of creative thinking. It is that evacuation itself, the evacuation that produces a form. And again, this is going to be vague, and it's going to be only partial, and maybe even uncertain. Several times, even earlier tonight, we've talked about the attitude of concrete thinking being questioning. One asks a question and creates a form in thought stuff, and that gets filled by truth. Profound question, such a question can influence the world for centuries. One kind of thinking, sometimes one thinker. Somebody like Socrates influenced philosophers and other people for many centuries. Intense questions, like questions when you're praying and you're deeply intense in asking something, it can produce miraculous changes. Now, these things are true, but they're based on earthly things. And being earthly, they have to be incomplete. Now, when we're building a creative archetype, we're doing something not earthly, but we're doing something heavenly. In this case, something between second and third heaven. So the perspective where we're looking is very different. So once again, we have to do that terrible thing of trying to understand spiritual or heavenly things using earthly images. It's terrible, but it's all we have, and we got to use what we have, and that's it. Sculpture is an art of making forms. And there are several ways a piece of sculpture can be made. And they are more or less materialistic. One of the ways is an additive process. You start with a frame, or you start with a base substance, and you keep adding to it until you have made the form that you want. This is the way the little children in schools make clay animals or something like that. In their studios, modern sculptors use sculpt metal, or they use fiberglass, something like that. Now that's a way of creating a form. It is the most materialistic way, because it's based exclusively on putting things together of matter, of this kind of matter, in this world. That's not the way spiritual things work. If we want to add something to our basic character, we have to do it from within and bring it out, which this is why we're reborn. We're coming out with a new edition because we want to add some experience to our lives. We want to be able to do something more, and we just can't do that by adding more to the external part of our being. We have to go back and start all over and come from within and come out again. Now, another way of producing a piece of sculpture is subtractive. You start with a block or a lump of substance, and you keep taking away. You subtract. You take material away until the form has been brought out from the basic beginning. This is how Michelangelo made the famous Pieta. He chopped it out of marble, which to me is astounding. This is how wood carvers work. It's how soap carvers work, or ice sculptors, or people like that. This is a little closer to spiritual creation because it has the whole idea that the piece of sculpture was there within the substance in potential, and all you had to do was bring it out of that potential. And that's a more spiritual way of doing things. Now, I have to admit that in myself, I must be terribly materialistic because I cannot conceive of doing the subtractive method. It doesn't dawn on me that if you gave me a block of marble or a big block of butter or something like that, that I could find something in there. But I suppose I could develop it. But I'm no different than the other people that have done it. So this is a little more spiritual way, but I don't think that this is the way that the archetypes are produced either. They seem to be made in the way that a piece of sculpture is made with a mold. The way that's commonly done is you make a figure of that you want, and you make it out of something very transient. I think it's usually wax that they make it out of. You make your figure either by the positive or negative way of sculpting it, and you have your figure, and then you coat it with clay, so that every bit of the surface of your primary, or your, I guess, your proto-figure is covered with it. And then you pour in something molten, which is usually bronze, and the wax melts and it runs out. And after the bronze has condensed, or it has fused, you break away the clay, and there you have your statue. That's the way the famous Perseus with the head of Medusa was made. You guys have seen that, haven't you, in the Garden of the Medici? That's one of the most famous statues of all. Oh, so is the Pieta. So that's the way Cellini did it. If you read his autobiography, he tells that's how he did it. However, that's closer, but it's not quite the way spiritual archetypes are made. It's similar because you have a mold, and then all of the matter of the lower worlds fill that mold up, and they become the things that we see around us. The idea of a chair is, or the thought of a chair, that is a form. Then you put the material in it, and you have a physical chair. Now, creative thought forms are much more likely made the way intaglios are made. And intaglio is the inverse of a cameo. You've all seen cameo rings where something stands out. An intaglio ring is where usually they're onyx, where it's been emptied out. It becomes like a form. And you see the inverse of the form, you see the inverse of the object in the hollow of the form. And in this case, the form is hollowed out of thought stuff. Now again, this is very simplistic, so we have to be careful not to jump to any conclusions about it. Again, there are problems using images as we're using them. They do help to clarify our understanding, but we're too apt to forget that where we are is physical reality, chemical physical reality. And when we forget, we want to think that things in the higher worlds are like they are here, which is not so. They're not. The higher worlds have different stuff, and they have different laws. There is no gravity in the world of thought, so there are other things that have to be active there. So we're too likely to think that things in the other worlds are like they are here. It's not a matter that these ideas are false. Most people think they are their bodies or their personalities. Now, our body is a reality, but it's only a small part of our total being. Christ in the Gospels tells us, "Know ye not that it is written, ye are gods?" So at this time, when the Spirit is re-immersing itself into concretion, into the world of concrete thought, it's much more divine than material in its consciousness. Most people here see themselves as their personalities. And most people don't know they are divine beings. And this materialistic attitude or habit of consciousness and the illusion that comes with it is so bad that some people actually have the experience of being in the Spirit. In religion, it's called a baptism by the Holy Spirit. They've had that experience and they know they're divine, but they are so habituated to thinking that the physical personality is their being that they talk about the Holy Spirit as if it were somebody else, and as if it were another being, and that it was not realizing it is their true being. So, when an individual is in the concrete subdivision, trying to express, trying to participate in its version of the divine plan, which is what the archetype of a life is, it is within the stuff of concrete thought. It's hollowing out the archetype from within. It's not the way you carve out an intaglio from without. It's something that you are within it and you hollow it out. More of this is going to come probably next week. Now at this point, it becomes very, very difficult for me, because there are reversals and reversals within reversals, and it's hard to understand it. Now, as the Spirit etches out an archetype, it is not an unprecedented creation. It is a miniature, from the viewpoint of humans, of the whole divine creative plan according to our experience of the whole evolutionary creation. More importantly, this is in the concrete subdivision, so it's relative to the lens of mind between the abstract and the concrete, there is an inversion when the idea, the divine idea of the creation, gets re-expressed in the concrete. There's an inversion. Well, it's sort of like if you take a lens and you project an image through it, it comes upside down on the other side, unless you have another corrective lens. Now there is another image that we can create that's even fraught with more possibility of misunderstanding. So beware. This is another case. It takes us back to our childhood. When we were children and we wanted to produce a picture, and we didn't have the ability to draw representatively, and we were too lazy or too impatient to learn how to draw, we would trace. We would take a piece of semi-translucent paper and we'd paste it over or lay it over the desired picture, and then we'd take a pencil or a crayon or something like that and we'd follow along the lines of the picture that was underneath as we saw through it, and when we pulled the paper off, we would have an image. Now, something along these lines is how the image is drawn or etched into an archetype. However, there is one all-important difference. The original that we are drawing from is abstract and not concrete. Now, any mathematician will tell you that the perfect circle cannot be seen by the physical eye. And if you have that, it isn't perfect. You cannot see, literally cannot see with the physical eye a perfect circle. But with the mind's eye, so to speak, you can see the generation of a circle and its properties, and you can see them well enough to produce a material facsimile. So you're seeing with your consciousness what is the idea of a circle. The projection of an abstract idea is in inversion. The archetype is an inversion. Not only is it hollowed out, it is an inversion of an invisible abstract idea. Now some say it is like the generation of a negative image in photography out of which the positive is produced. So when the archetype draws into itself the matter coming from the other direction, from the lower world, it's very much like the bronze that is poured into the mold. There's another inversion. Instead of being in, it is outwardly expressed. Now, tracing from the abstract idea, one is doing that as though facing the spirit. That's one perspective. While facing the more concrete worlds on the other side of the lens, or looking away from the lens, is very much like pouring into the mold. So it's a different perspective. It's a reversed perspective. And in this latter perspective, one is in the position of a weaver who weaves a Persian rug. Because the weavers who weave Persian rugs work from the backside. The final product of what the rug looks like is understood by the weaver who is seeing the backside of it. This takes place in that lovely Chinese thing where what is that embroidery, where they make those animals. I saw one in Chicago at the Art Institute. They had an exhibit at the Natural Science Museum. They had 10,000 years of Chinese culture. And they had one of those things of a gauze-like piece of cloth. And in one side it was the leaping tiger, and on the other side it was the tiger pouncing down. And it was so thin, and the stitches from one didn't interfere with the stitches from the other. So that's another one of those cases that you make the positive by working from the back side or from the reality. Now, if you look back at everything that we've said tonight, one thing comes to mind. It seems that it's too complicated. And it seems that way because it is too complicated. It always is that way when you start breaking things down to understand them. Even such a simple thing as walking, which we do every day. If you try to understand it, you have to look into all of the neuromuscular activity and the sense of balance and all of that. It becomes very complicated. Whereas once you start walking, it's a simple thing. You can change your pace, you can do all of those kinds of things. And what we're doing is more like the breaking down, because we're trying to produce the walking figure by looking at components of it. And we're doing that indirectly through analogy. Sometime it will be a matter that we'll just wake up doing it. If we think about it, if to the degree that we're successful in what we're doing tonight in this talk and probably the next one, we'll be able to do much better when we're coming back to rebirth, because we'll have an understanding of what we're doing. Even a simple thing like drawing, sketching, when you do it, it seems impossibly hard to do, but you stay with it, and pretty soon it's as natural as breathing. This is one of the wonders of studying mysticism and trying to live it, is we can do better. One of the things is that thronging sense of idealism, of wanting to improve and wanting to do better in all the things that we do. All right, we're coming down to the end. This is supposed to last less than an hour. Now we have, hopefully, some of the simple basics of what one does to produce a thought form and come to rebirth. We have some of the simple basics of what's taking place at this time of the cycle. But what we have is just a skeleton. And we need more than a skeleton to live. So the skeleton alone is a symbol of death. So we need to flesh out the basics. And all these simple little things we have to flesh out into something that is full and real. So to do that, we're going to spend the rest of this evening and all of the next talk fleshing. And we're going to create more of these little vignettes, and hopefully we can put them all together and we'll have a gigantic multi-dimensional pastiche of what it's like producing an archetype. Now, one thing to keep in mind, to understand this stage of the cycle, is we do not work alone. When we're in our body here, we almost always think alone. Emotion is unifying. If you feel something from the desire world, it'll be a sweep of desire, and be it war, hysteria, or some kind of manic fad or something like that, everybody gets carried along with it. But when we think here, we think alone. When we are in second heaven, building this thought form, we work with many different kinds of beings. Some assist us, and we assist others. But mostly it is that we are assisted. And the reason for our needing assistance is that we're not completely awake in this stage of evolution as humans. Earlier in this talk, the point was made that if we are awake in the self, we are awake of ourselves as divinities. And that's not a contradiction to what we're saying now. The assertion we're making now is equally true. Now, because we are divine beings and we have creative capacities, and we are awake to that to a degree, it's almost unbelievable how conscious and awake we are when we think about it relative to our dim consciousness that we have here. But even that is, we're not awake at full capacity. And part of the reason is because of evolution, and part of the reason is devolution. The reality is that we are retarded from our intended development, which will eventually be when we get on pace again, and when we complete the awakening, will be spectacular. We're stunted in our development because we ignore our higher consciousness. And we numb ourselves into thinking this is the only reality, and we have a preoccupation with it. And we've also squandered the divine creative energy in sexual gratification. So in some ways, we lack the courage to do the things necessary to remedy this situation. We lack the courage sometimes to face things about ourselves. Sometimes that's arduous work. It's unpleasant. But they're necessary for awakening. There is an old saw that says no pains will be spared to see that you get exactly what you need. And in this case, exactly what we need is awakening. Now, some of the beings that we are assisted by at this time are called the recording angels or the lords of destiny. We are what we are because of what we have done and what we have not done with the conditions that have been presented to us. Because of the totality of cause and consequence, it can't be any other way. Now, earlier in this series of talks on the life cycle, when we were discussing the post-mortem rather than the prenatal, we discussed how after death we process experience from the life just finished, and we extract the soul material, which is absorbed into the spirit, and it gets assimilated to where it should go, and we become more conscious, and we become more creatively potent. Now, in an unfallen ideal world, when we would do this world, our causes would be less personal. They'd be less subjective. And they would contribute more to evolution and resolve into new creative causes. This is the way it happens in nature. Nature goes from one perfection to another perfection. Nature is not ugly, it's astoundingly beautiful. You can't really be too down on Midas because nature is so beautiful as it is. However, we don't live in an unfallen world. And it's pretty obvious that our contribution to the ongoing creation is pretty messed up. And we only have to look into nature to see that we do terrible things to make beautiful nature pretty ugly. Because of these things, our work in the post-mortem is not very efficient. We don't get as much out of experience as we could get out of it. Added to this is the fact that we tend, in our, excessive ways, we generate more unregenerate destiny than can be worked out in a lifetime. And as a consequence of that, since we've probably been more imperfect in the past than we are now, we have a very large backlog of unredeemed destiny, which people of a more religious and simpler point of view call a burden of sin. And we do carry a burden of sin around. We were blind, usually. We were blind to our causes when we committed them. And to some extent, our eyes have been opened in purgatory. And in some extent, we are still blind to working them out. And because we have gotten the soul material, hopefully enough to produce conscience, it isn't over. We have to be able to be given the same temptations, with temptations, the whole world around us is temptations, and treat it as though those temptations are on some kind of tabula rasa, a blank sheet, so that when we are presented with them, we know that they aren't the way to go. Then there's the fact that some causes take more time to come to ripeness than others. Some things that we set in motion now, some thoughts that we think, will not come to full ripeness for perhaps thousands of years. It isn't all just pay-as-you-go destiny. Well, you step on the head of the rake and you get bopped in the head by the handle. That still happens to me yet. It really does. I have a little small tool shed back here for the garden, and sometimes I have to get way into the back. And it happened this summer again that trying to make my way in there, I stepped on the head of the rake and got bopped in the head. Oh, who would speak about great spiritual things steps on a rake head and gets bopped. And the wise shall be captured in their folly. And then there's the fact that sometimes we dawdle. We take our good time. And we just sort of play around. And we often try to avoid unpleasant destiny, even though it's ripe and the best thing for us. So this, again, retards progress in rebirth. So we might have a perfectly planned destiny and still go awry and force things to be put off to another life. And then there's the fact that we are not always reborn with the same individuals at the same time. We have people that we're close to now, and some of them, if we're very close, we may be reborn with them again, but often we're not. They have a destiny that's different than ours. Now, some people at this point, when the recording angels are helping them to build their archetype, they're given an option of being born here or here or here at this time or that time and working out destiny with these groups of people. Some destiny can be worked out with many people, but some of it is very specific. Sometimes we do something to one person very, very bad or very, very good. And that person may have their own destiny. And in their destiny, they may not be reborn at a time when we're reborn, when we can make it up to them. So it'll have to be deferred. So we can see, now this is something that is not more complicated because of the presentation of it. This is complicated because it is complicated. Now, there are principles, mathematical principles and physics principles that show that this is not as complicated as it seems. That a lot of these things can be worked out. I don't know if you read books like, Gödel, Escher, Bach, have any of you read that? It's about the incompleteness theory. It's a very, very beautiful book, and it shows mathematically that some things, even though they seem very impossible, are not so impossible. But we do have specific destiny. And this has to be worked out just right. I don't know how to say it. We get exactly what we need, when we need it, where we need it, and with whom we need it. We get exactly what we need. We may not like it. Destiny is ironic. It's poetic justice. We get exactly what we need, even though we would try to run away from it. And this is because, not because of our own making, but because we are helped to, in our timing, by the recording angels and the lords of destiny. They have a consciousness of destiny that is so exalted that it is extremely, extremely rare that there is ever an error, that something happens that we shouldn't have happened. So, when we're spirits at this time, we're in the self, and we're doing the thinking and creating our life. We're not pig-headed, and we're not pridefully stubborn as we are here. And we cooperate. I think sometimes we have to be fooled a little bit because, things happen that are even in spirit. We didn't have a lower nature when we fell. The original sin didn't happen to a lower nature. It happened to a self. That self wasn't very awake. So things do happen that we get into an attitude of self that we have to more or less be tricked into what is right for us, and we're like little children in that. But that is one of the factors that is in play at this time as we're preparing to come back to rebirth. We are helped, and we're helped to get exactly what we need, and it is all for our ultimate good. It's all for our betterment. So this is part of building a archetype for a new life. And now the next time we meet, we're going to have a lot more of things that we do with other beings and what is necessary to complete the archetype before coming back to rebirth. And it should be every bit as much fun as this has been. Are there any questions? Okay. We'll call it at that.